Well, thank you for taking the time to join me this evening. It's been a struggle to get this episode done. We were trying to do it actually soon after you did an interview for Southside Magazine. Your most recent book, After Black Lives Matter, discusses the failures and limitations of that organization. Where are they in regards to this migrant crisis? Or are they not as prevalent in Chicago? And then what Black run orgs outside of the NAACP, because we spoke about it many times on this show, and I wrote about it actually for Sublation magazine, that the Illinois chapter of the NAACP has not been very gracious to the migrants. But what Black run orgs outside of the NAACP are speaking out on what's happening. Is it kind of an anti-migrant sentiment across the board, or is it a little more nuanced than that?
Yeah, so I would say in this case, right, the forces that we would associate with Black Lives Matter have been some of the most progressive on this issue, right? So today is election day in Chicago, and one of the measures on the ballot is the Bring Chicago Home referendum. And what this would do is basically change the situation we have now, which is a pretty much a flat tax when it comes to real estate transfers,
Okay.
and it would create a graduated tax. So for those persons who purchase a property and a transaction is less than $1 million, your taxes would go down.
Go down?
Yeah, it would go down if it's like a less than $1 million purchase. But for those who make purchases above $1 million, there would be a much heavier tax levied. And also on the same ballot measure, it would cause for the use of those funds that are generated to pay for housing for the unhoused or homeless, right?
Okay.
And so this is one of the attempts that I think the mayor has endorsed. It's also one that a few of the most progressive members of the city council have supported, and it's one that's been really advanced by activist named Asha Ransby Sporn, who is a younger activist who comes out of anti-carceral activism, comes from a family of academics and activists, and so
Abolitionists mostly.
people, yeah, people on the ground here are pushing for that. We'll see what happens. There was a pretty strong campaign against it, mounted by surprise the real estate and landlord interests across the city who were against this idea of increasing taxes on themselves. And so, pretty strong media blast, constant commercials on television and on radio and other places to try to dissuade people from voting. One of the unfortunate things is that, from what I understand, and I haven't looked at the outcome of today's election yet, um, but the turnout, from what I heard earlier, was pretty low, and they were expecting to pick up once people got off work. But if it's low, I suspect that referendum measure will fail.
Mm.
But it is one of those instances where we see black activists who are not, taking a Trump type position when it comes to the migrants, and who actually are trying to figure out ways to address the unhoused population in the city more generally. So it's exciting. But like I said, I've heard stories just today. One friend of mine whose daughter voted for the first time
Oh, wow.
told me that when they looked at the paper ballot, it didn't even have the Bring Chicago Home referendum on it. And so, Chicago legendarily is a place where there's all manner of chicanery and political meddling that happens, bad behavior on election day. So I just think it's, on the one side, a great sign of what's possible and that people are organizing to try to address these issues and think about redistributive public policy. But at the same time, from everything I'm hearing so far, there's a chance that it may not pass.
It's interesting that you're talking about reallocating funds to the homeless population because Chicago does not have a large homeless population. The irony of this migrant crisis is Texas actually has a pretty large homeless population,
Right.
as does Florida, two of the
Mhm.
states that have been busing immigrants to cities like Chicago and New York.
Right.
Um, but if you add in this influx of migrants, your homeless population is a little closer to California.
Yeah,
Still
I
not
mean,
as big, but it's a little closer to California. So is that what
right.
this is also going to go to as well? Are we looking at the migrants also as the unhoused?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Cook County, there may be around 68,000 people who are technically categorized as homeless. And then the asylum seekers or refugees total over 35,000. So it basically, it adds up to a pretty large population of people. And I think this has been one of the slow moving responses. It would have been great if people in the mayor's inner circle, had seized upon this from the very beginning, and took what are essentially two artificial crises, right? I would argue that of course, the migrant crisis on its face is artificial. It's something that engineered by the right, right wing strategists who wanted to utilize this sanctuary city rhetoric as a way of driving a wedge into the Democratic Party and some of its strongholds, places like Chicago, Los Angeles, and elsewhere.
Mhm.
And so it's an artificial crisis from the vantage point of the refugees and the migrants. It's also artificial when it comes to the unhoused. I mean, these are issues that can be addressed, right? I mean, the fact that people don't have housing is not a natural state of affairs. It is an outcome of a society where we treat housing as a commodity, and where we've invested a tremendous amount of money over the last 100 years, essentially, to make sure that the idea that housing is a commodity, housing should be resolved through property markets and not through state policy. That has become the dominant idea in American political life, and I just think it's not a real one. I mean, we're at a moment right now. If we think about the migrants or the refugees, the unhoused, as one extreme in a broader set of problems regarding housing in the U.S. I mean, I just saw recently where most Americans, half of Americans, can't even afford to pay, um, their rent right now. I mean, people are
Mhm.
making tough decisions between what they're going to eat for dinner, what their kids are going to wear. They're making tough decisions because we know the rent always eats first, right? Rent has to get paid first, and the large amount of Americans who can pay are deeply housing or rent burdened, right? So they're paying more than one third, and sometimes much more, in order to cover the cost of rent and utilities. And so this is a much deeper crisis. I think we have to connect them all together. And it seems that some of the most progressive organizers and activists in Chicago are trying to do that in other places as well. But I
Mhm.
just think it's necessary to bring the discussions about the migrants, bring the discussions about the unhoused back into this broader conversation about the patent limitations of housing as a commodity, right? I mean, we can go all the way back to Frederick Engels and the housing question. I mean, one of the arguments that he's making is that this is not a real crisis of capitalism. It is actually how capitalism works. Um, Dispossession is an outcome of treating housing as a commodity and not as a right, which is what it should be. That we should all have a place to reproduce ourselves each day, a place where we can have some security and safety from the rest of the world. And so this is a bigger problem. It's a longer standing problem. I think ideologically, a lot of Americans can't really see it because we've all embraced this idea of the house as an aspiration, the house as a way of creating wealth. I mean, even a lot of Black discourse over the last, decade or so, the discussions around reparations, the focus on discrimination in the post-war period, the way people have talked about, Black wealth, it all goes back to this idea that housing should be not only a place where we restore ourselves, reproduce ourselves, but it should also be a means of wealth creation. I mean, this is the core set of American ideological views that's been popularized, like I said, for at least 100 years now. And we need to break free of it. I think this is the moment we should start to
Well,
cut some of
here's
the ties.